A chance remark by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry sets up a potential breakthrough in Syria. Russia and France are backing a proposal for Syria to surrender its chemical weapons. But is this practical or even possible? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. The U.S. had been accused of rushing to war, but an off-the-cuff statement by Secretary of State John Kerry has spurred a possible breakthrough in the Syrian chemical weapons crisis. His suggestion that Damascus gives up its chemical weapons has been embraced by Russia and welcomed in Syria. And France says it will now put a proposal to the UN Security Council. Well, here's how John Kerry inadvertently or otherwise set events in motion.
Sure, he could turn over every single bit of his chemical weapons to the international community in the next week. Turn it over, all of it, without delay, and allow a full and total accounting for that. But he isn't about to do it, and it can't be done, obviously.
All right, well, backtracking a little at the end, perhaps, but Russia seized upon the idea, proposing that Syria's chemical weapons are placed under international control and then destroyed.
We are currently working to prepare a workable, precise and concrete plan with the Syrian side. We are hoping to present this plan soon, and we will be ready to work on it with the UN Secretary-General, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and members of the UN Security Council.
Well, that in turn led to this statement from the French foreign minister setting out the terms of a draft resolution to be submitted to the UN Security Council.
Firstly, to condemn the August 21st massacre committed by the Syrian regime. Secondly, to demand from this regime to bring fully to light its chemical weapons program, place it under international control and dismantle it. To outline very serious consequences in the case of serious violation of its obligations. Finally, for the perpetrators of the August 21st massacre to be sanctioned in front of the International Criminal Court.
Well, such a plan would possibly avert the need for military intervention, but questions are being raised about just how Syria would be expected to hand over its weapons of mass destruction, a monumental task even in times of peace. Well, Syria is one of a handful of countries not to have signed the Chemical Weapons Convention. This requires signatories to exclude completely the possibility of the use of chemical weapons. Well, Syria is said to have started its chemical weapons program in the 1970s, helped first by Egypt and then the Soviet Union. But it wasn't until July last year that it publicly acknowledged possessing weapons of mass destruction. A foreign ministry spokesman stressed at the time, no chemical or biological weapons will ever be used, and I repeat, will never be used during the crisis in Syria, no matter what the developments inside Syria. Well, a French intelligence report released earlier this month said Syria had one of the biggest operational stocks of chemical weapons. And this is said to include more than 1,000 tons of sarin and mustard gas and neurotoxic agents. Those are gases which attack the respiratory and nervous systems and can be fatal within minutes of contact. Let's bring in our guests for this show. We have in Washington Amy Smithson. She's a senior fellow at the James Martin Center for Non-proliferation Studies. Amy also chairs the Global Affairs Council on Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Weapons for the World Economic Forum. Over in Vienna, Dieter Rothbacher, he's Operations Director at Hotzone Solutions. And Dieter helped train UN chemical weapons inspectors in Syria, in fact. And over in New York, we have Elliot Ackerman. Elliot's a military analyst and founder of the Syria Research and Evaluation Organization. Good to have you all with us on Inside Story on Al Jazeera. So this proposal that was initially put forward by the Russians for the Syrians to effectively give up their reported chemical weapons stockpile. Let's just break it down first. Dieter, let me come over to you. How would it exactly work? What would be the process of identifying and then controlling, putting the stockpile under international control and then destroying it?
Well, one of the first things that would need to be done is, of course, that the Syrian government declares its stockpile. So they have to come forward with a declaration, like it happened in the past 20 years ago, Iraq, when they declared their CW stockpile, and now how a number of countries have done in the framework of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So this declaration needs to be put forward, and based upon this declaration, then the planning process within the UN for an inspection with a first aim of inventorying the stockpile can start. So this would be the very first step.
Elliot, over to you, because Dieter raised an important point there, and that is the declaration by the Syrian government. I mean, it's a program that's been shrouded in secrecy. So do you see the likelihood of that happening?
Well, it seems today that there are some developments that, for instance, the Syrian Foreign Minister Moallem has said that they're willing to open up the books, so to speak, on their chemical weapons program. And then the rhetoric you're seeing out of Washington, D.C. is a bit of skepticism. However, I think all sides believe that this is something that's worth pursuing, having the Syrians declare their chemical weapons and let in inspectors.
Amy, the Russian proposal seems to imply that Syria would have to sign the International Chemical Weapons Convention and really forcing it to divulge every detail of its arsenal. What do you make of that?
Well, this wouldn't be the first time that has happened in history. After the 1991 Gulf War, the international community pretty much demanded that Saddam Hussein do just that and cooperate with the disarmament of Iraq. The United Nations Special Commission was created for that purpose, to literally oversee the disarmament of Iraq's nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons programs. Saddam Hussein completely denied having nuclear and biological weapons, but the inspectors caught him red-handed in that. And over the course of many, many years, and the first step mentioned here has been declarations, Saddam Hussein's Iraq filed full, final, and complete declarations, which are completely and totally false. So this first step, as was mentioned, can be very, very tricky indeed. And that's the basis upon which inspectors must work. I don't think Assad's government is going to tell the truth here.
Dieter, you are certainly one person who can comment on Iraq with your experience there, and specifically with the reported chemical weapons arsenal. Is there a comparison between this situation in Syria and Iraq?
The same situation almost when you look at that, and like Amy already said, now we're looking at probably a UN Security Council resolution that will force Syria, one way or another, to declare, to open the books. And we had the same, like it was just outlined by Amy, done before in Iraq. And then, of course, also for Iraq, an international team was put together to at first inventory and then oversee the destruction. And I myself spent quite some time in Iraq overseeing the destruction on the ground on a daily basis, and there was significant progress made, especially in the area of the chemical weapons arsenal that was there in Iraq, and the destruction of whatever was left after the war took about 2 years. And when you look at the tons that were destroyed at the time in Iraq, they are somewhat comparable to the amount now that we find in Syria, but that of course still needs to be verified with the first inspection that will hit the ground and really look into the storage of their CW arsenal.
And who, Dieter, would you expect to take the lead on this? I mean, how would it work? Who would go in there, and what would be the process of controlling the weapons and then destroying them? Well,
at first, of course, there are two scenarios, and both were mentioned already. One is that Syria will ratify the Chemical Weapons Convention, but that's probably a longer process, and I don't think that's going to happen very soon. So I think we will look into a scenario where we have another UN Security Council resolution with all sorts of requirements that need to be met by the Syrian government. And then you have to bring the team on the ground. They have to assess even how the chemical weapons are stored, which type of chemical weapons are there, because up until now we don't have any real full picture of what is there. They say that some of the weapons, the nerve agents in particular, are stored in a binary way. That means the final chemical products, the two final chemical products, are stored separately, and they will only be put together to create that nerve agent prior to use. So that means that these chemicals are stored probably in bulk containers, which will make inventory, storage, and particularly movement of that very, very difficult. And you have a specific type of agent, namely mustard gas or blister agent, which is supposedly stored in munitions. But then again, if it's in munitions, you want to take it out, you have to take it out, and that's a quite delicate and dangerous operation to do, as we have learned in Iraq and even further on in other countries that have declared and destroyed CW.
And just one more with you, Dieter, before I speak to Amy and Elliot. How long would this take?
When you look at the destruction that took place in Iraq with the declared stockpile at the time, 93 and 94, we looked at 2 years. But of course, there was some work that needed to be done beforehand, before the destruction operations could start, meaning that they had to build destruction facilities. At the time, they had an incinerator where they were burning CW. They had a chemical plant where they were chemically destroying certain parts of their arsenal. And they had a third area where they did the so-called open pit burning that is now forbidden under the Chemical Weapons Convention because it's not really good for the environment. But in case you cannot transport munitions because they're unsafe to handle, whatever, that still might be an option in Iraq. So coming back, in Syria, coming back to your question, overall, I'm looking at probably years and not months.
Elliot, what do you make of that? I mean, the international community seems to be scrambling. It's the 11th hour, trying to come up with some sort of diplomatic solution to the crisis and the war that's going on in Syria. And according to Dieter, this process could take many, many years.
Well, if you look at the alternatives, which is unilateral or near unilateral strikes by the United States, with the potential of escalation, which I think if you look at where the American people are at, there's a lot of war fatigue. 2 years, although it sounds long when the news cycle on this current crisis is being measured in hours, when you look in retrospect over the past decade, and for the United States coming out of a 6-year war in Iraq and a decade-plus war that's still ongoing in Afghanistan, 2 or 3 years doesn't seem that long of a time. And that being said, if you look at just the politics of the war right now, that these developments make it extremely difficult for President Obama to go forward and make his case to the American people that the only option on the table are unilateral strikes from naval ships out in the Mediterranean or standoff bombers. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this situation develops, but the one thing that I would say with a degree of certainty is that the discussions on this are going to be ongoing.
Amy, the timeline being put forward by Elliot as well as Dieter is 2 to 3 years, but you are talking about a country here that is in the midst of civil war. I mean, is this just venturing into sort of uncharted territory?
This is definitely uncharted territory because the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the inspectorate for the chemical weapons ban, has never sent inspectors into a zone where bullets are flying. Nor, for that matter, did the United Nations Special Commission, the entity established to disarm Iraq after the 1991 war, deliberately do that. Occasionally, the Iraqis shot at the inspectors, but usually they tried to get the inspectors out if hostilities were ongoing. Let's keep in mind that these facilities that Syria has, their production, research and development, and storage facilities are located in urban areas where hostilities are underway. So sending inspectors in just to do this accounting or inventory is going to be a hazardous task for any inspectors that undertake this job. The other thing to keep in mind is that let's go for the case of Muammar Gaddafi. Again, Gaddafi forfeited his chemical weapons and other weapons of mass destruction programs in early 2004 and signed the Chemical Weapons Convention. But we know after Gaddafi was killed that the interim government in Tripoli declared he had held some back. And in this case, what I'm worried about is that the international community is so eager to avoid doing the difficult but right thing that they might accept a deal that is unwise or foolish. This situation will leave Assad with chemical weapons for months, if not years, to come. I am gravely concerned that he would use chemical weapons again during this time period and do what he's done in the past, which is point the finger at the rebels. I'm also concerned that there will be a series of interferences with the inspection process. Already this has been demonstrated. Just a week and a half ago, the inspectors were bottled up inside their hotel in Damascus, while the Assad regime bombed the heck out of the sites where the chemical attacks took place. So there's already an ample track record to indicate that this is a regime that cannot be trusted to come clean about its chemical weapons program. So what do we do in the interim? Hopefully, in addition to this deal, we do things like flood Syria with chemical defenses. Literally, Syrian civilians need gas masks, their doctors need nerve agent antidotes, there need to be chemical detectors put into this equation, as well as the rebels. The Syrian troops have these capabilities, but lives can be saved if Syrians are coached with simple instructions in Arabic and with illustrations about how to don gas masks and decontaminate in the aftermath of a chemical attack.
All right,
This is doable.
All right, Elliot, what do you make of...
It's an insurance plan.
Elliot, what do you make of what Amy is saying?
I think that's all well and good, and and the U.S. and its allies have already been providing non-lethal aid to the Syrian rebels. But again, all of this gets lost in the execution. For instance, up until this weekend, the only course of action that was on the table was to reduce Assad's chemical weapons stockpiles through the use of what's been termed precision strikes, but using Tomahawk missiles off of our destroyers, as well as various munitions off of standoff bombers, which is anything but precise and much less precise than whatever's being mentioned by the UN. Although granted, imperfect. And again, I think it's a noteworthy idea to try to provide an increased access to gas masks and anti-chemical treatments for civilians, perhaps through the rebels and perhaps even through Assad's regime. But at the end of the day, the way the American people, by and large, are looking at this, if you look at recent polling data, is that the alternative to go to war over this, or to even get into a situation that can escalate in what is already a proxy war between the Russians and the Iranians, is a course of action that is not sustainable and is also not advisable. So we're making a decision based off of what are many imperfect options. But whenever we're refusing one of those imperfect options, we have to ask them, what is the alternative that we're going to go to?
Amy, I see you want to respond.
Thank you. Actually, as far as I understand, the chemical weapons sites themselves were taken off very publicly by the Obama administration, taken off the target list. And there's good reason to do so, because attempting to bomb them would perhaps release toxic gases over nearby civilian populations. In this case, again, defenses aren't a perfect solution. There's no easy solution to this situation, and I agree with the ever-expanding potential ramifications of military strikes into Syria. There are all sorts of complications that could come from that. So in this case, I'm seeking a series of things that are part of this equation that appears to be taking shape, not just an agreement by the Assad government to forfeit its weapons, but an insurance policy in terms of chemical defenses in the hands of Syrian civilians and rebels that would actually take away the military advantage from the Assad regime of using these weapons in the first place.
Right.
Chemical weapons can't kill you if you have a gas mask on.
Okay, but I just have to bring up that the Obama administration is saying the point of these limited military strikes is to punish Bashar al-Assad.
Yes, indeed, that is what they are saying. And I'm actually delighted that the international community is attempting to come up with a way to uphold not only the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which bans the use of these weapons, but the Chemical Weapons Convention, which bans their production, development, and use. In 1988, when Saddam Hussein slaughtered civilians at Halabja with chemical weapons, the international community turned a blind eye. So in a certain sense, we're seeing the international community actually get a backbone when it comes to chemical warfare. And this is very, very sorely needed, because when these weapons are used against unarmed civilians, the casualty tolls escalate in alarming numbers.
All right. Well, let's just take a look quickly at where Syria's chemical weapons are reportedly stored. Well, this is according to the Center for Non-proliferation Studies. Syria has production sites in Latakia, in Hama, and in Homs. And its biggest production facility and missile base is in Al Safir, that's in the north. And it also has storage facilities dotted around the country and a research center in the capital, Damascus, dating back to 1971, reportedly. Well, Syria is, in fact, one of 7 countries that have not ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention. The others are Israel, North Korea, Myanmar, Egypt, Angola, and South Sudan. All right, Dieter, you, in fact, led the UN weapons team that was going into Syria to investigate the latest chemical weapons attack, the alleged chemical weapons attack on August the 21st. You trained them, in fact, before they went in. I mean, could, in your opinion, all sides in this conflict, and it's not as easy as just saying it's the government versus the opposition, because we know that the rebels are splintered into many different groups, but could the various sides in the Syrian war be persuaded to abide by a ceasefire to allow weapons inspectors in to begin this proposal of dismantling and destroying if it is ratified by the United Nations?
Well, thanks. I mean, the thing is, I just want to clarify that the training aspect of it. As I said, I worked up until 2009 for almost 10 years for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I was an inspection team leader, so I was also leading inspections into Libya, as Libya was mentioned before. And I was, for my last 5 years, in charge of training the chemical weapons inspectors that are that you find within the inspectorate in that particular organization. So that's why I trained them, but that was years ago. Right. So meaning 3-4 years ago, and I know quite a number of them. But I have to come back to a few things that were said before, and mainly by Amy. First thing, I'm refraining from, in any kind of discussions now in media contact, from passing judgment and actually who did what in this. I really want to wait for the outcome of the UN report that is hopefully going to be released and published in the next days, maybe beginning of next week. The other thing is also hostilities. I worked as a weapons inspector for the UN, for UNSCOM in the 90s, and also just before the war in 2003 for UNMOVIC, which was the successor organization. The only bullets that we had at the time were not the bullets from the Iraqis. I was living in Baghdad for 6 months, and the only thing that flew in was actually from the Allied forces, were cruise missiles, or in the no-fly zone in 2003 up north, was bombing that we were watching from the hotel from the Allied forces. So the UN does send people in areas where sometimes bombings and even shootings happen. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, however, does not do that. So the state party needs to guarantee the security and the safety of the inspectors that are going in. And when you look at the guys now that were from the OPCW, they were actually going into Syria wearing a UN hat. So the thing is, all the guys now that would go in and start probably inventorying based upon the declaration, they know that they go into an environment that is probably not 100% safe. You have about 1,200 groups of the opposition forces, the rebels, that are fighting the Assad regime. So security is a bit of an issue there. I fully agree. The other thing is also, I think a UN Security Council resolution, a mandate now that would justify to send in an inspection team, they can start inventorying, would already be the start of a peaceful process. And of course, then the process might take some years until you have reached the end point, meaning the end point of destruction, that all the stuff that has, of course, been declared, that has been found, might take years, yes, but I think it would be very good to start the process as soon as possible. And there I agree with Elliot. It's definitely a lot better than just going and bombing the country, bombing various areas and targets. I don't think that would solve the issue in Syria. And the last thing, as Amy said, the population, the people, they need to be equipped with gas masks. Well, gas masks alone do not protect you against chemical warfare agents. They protect the respiratory tract, but they don't protect the skin and other areas. So it depends which type of agent would be used even in the future let's still wait for the UN report to come out to see what has been used.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for all my guests. We had Amy Smithson, Dieter Rothbacher, and Elliot Ackerman. Thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. And to our viewers, you can always find the show and others at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, and you can add to the debate, in fact, by leaving a comment for us. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye for now.